Hi, my name is Kimberly Gier, and I am a student in the Savvy Coders Data Analytics and Python program. And today I'd like to present to you my capstone project for that course, Chicago versus Airbnb. Does Chicago need stronger short-term rental regulations? I chose this topic for my capstone project because I am a traveler. I love to travel, and when I travel, I like to stay in Airbnbs. They are often more spacious. Sometimes the property or the neighborhood you stay in can be more interesting than what you would get staying in a hotel, and especially if you travel in a large group, this can be a lot cheaper, a lot more cost effective than buying hotel rooms for everyone. But I'm also trying to be a responsible traveler, and I know that there can be a dark side to Airbnbs, and that is that, if I have a house that I rent out to tourists as an Airbnb, or if I have an apartment that I rent out to tourists as an Airbnb, that is a house or apartment that somebody probably, can't be living in. And so a large number of Airbnbs in a city can create some pressure, squeeze on the housing market, and create some problems. And so cities all over the world have begun to regulate Airbnbs to try and limit the number of short-term rentals of this kind that are available in their city in order to preserve their own housing stock. And so I chose to take a look at the Airbnb situation in Chicago because it is a large city somewhat near me. It does have short-term rental regulations, but they are not of the most strict kind. And because Chicago is a place I've been to on a number of occasions, and I've definitely stayed in some Airbnbs there, so I kind of wanted to know, how big of a problem is this in Chicago? And to begin to answer that question, I got a couple of data sets. Both data sets that I'm looking at in this project came initially from a website called InsideAirbnb.com, which provides detailed information about listings of Airbnbs in different cities and places around the world. InsideAirbnb.com makes these data sets available for up to a year, but I knew that I also wanted to kind of take a look at some longer term trends, and so I found an older data set on a site called Kaggle.com. This data originally did come from InsideAirbnb.com, but it was archived here after someone else used it for some data analysis. And so I am able to base my findings today on data from September 2020 and June 2024. This project also contains some additional information from the city of Chicago, from Zillow.com, and from Rent.com, just to provide some context for what's going on in this market. During this course, I also had the opportunity to become certified in Agile methodologies, fundamentals of Agile, and I participated in regular Agile ceremonies, both in the role of a developer and product manager. We did sprint planning, regular stand-up meetings, sprint retrospectives, and we used the Gier system to track our team progress towards our individual projects. I also, during the course of this project, had the opportunity to learn and demonstrate some of the components of the Agile mindset, particularly looking at things like growth mindset, because I came into this course with really very little coding experience at all, and I've learned a lot of things and been able to put them to work almost immediately. In this course, some of those things I learned and used were Python 3, Jupyter Notebooks, and Visual Studio Code. Python libraries, including Pandas, NumPy, and Matplotlib. Used SQLite to explore, clean, wrangle, and organize my data, and Tableau to create some visualizations and to create this presentation. I have a couple of slides here that just show some examples of that work. Here I am taking some data away from my two data sets and combining them with Pandas into a data frame that I could then work with further, do some further shaping and analysis to. And I've also got here a example of an SQL query where I'm looking at some individual listings that appear in both of my data sets and trying to track what's going on with them across the two time periods. I also had the opportunity to do things like create visualizations with Matplotlib, this little scatter plot I made that investigated the relationship, if any, between how many Airbnb listings a particular host owned and how well they could expect those listings to perform. So that's a lot about my process. What did I find out? So to begin with, Chicago has some very specific short-term rental regulations. If you have a property that you want to rent out as a short-term rental, you have to have a shared housing registration number for that property. If you have more than one property, you have to also obtain a shared housing unit operator license for yourself. There are some further limitations on where you can put your short-term rental. There are some density kind of limits so that you can't, for example, buy a whole condo building and rent out every one of the condos as an Airbnb. And Chicago also reserves the ability to designate specific buildings or specific neighborhoods totally off limits to short-term rentals. And these are rules that apply to any rental that you can rent out for less than 32 nights at a time. That's what Chicago defines as a short-term rental. So if you've got something that you rent month to month, or an apartment that you rent for a whole year in a more traditional lease situation, these rules don't apply. We're only looking at the kind of short stay, tourist-focused rentals here. And I started out by looking at compliance with the licensure requirements, and it turns out that in 2024, almost everybody with a listing on Airbnb was in compliance with this regulation. They all have these shared housing registration numbers, which I was pretty impressed by. What I expected to find when I looked at the overall trends in short-term rentals in Chicago based on these regulations and kind of what I know about how this has worked in other cities, I would expect to find that between 2020 and 2024, the number of short-term rentals would increase. And I would also expect to find the number of what I think of as being professional hosts would increase. And these are people who own multiple listings, people who own many buildings, and have as a primary source of income the short-term rental income from listing these buildings on platforms like Airbnb. So I would expect that overall there would be more short-term rentals and that there would be more professional hosts between 2020 and 2024. So let's see what I actually did find. What I found to begin with is that Chicago has a lot of Airbnb listings. And when I looked at the listing counts in 2020 and 2024, I'd see that they did indeed increase from about 6,400 in 2020 to almost 8,000 in 2024. But these are not just short-term rentals. Airbnb also includes listings that are apartments you can rent by the month or even by the year. And so those aren't really the kinds of listings I'm interested in. I'm interested in the short-term rentals. I'm interested in these tourist rentals. And I found that over time, the number of those rentals in Chicago actually declined from 6,088 in 2020 to 5,319 in 2024. So that's the first part of my hypothesis out of the water. I'm wrong there. Why am I wrong? What's going on? So that's something I wanted to find out. When I looked at the number of professional hosts in Chicago, though, I'm more on target. In 2020, 57% of listings were owned by people who only had one or two listings, and the other 43% were owned by what I would think of as being professional hosts. When I looked at 2024, the share of people with only one or two listings had dropped to 47.23%, and the corresponding increase in professional hosted listings. I did notice that in 2020, there is one particular host that had 205 short-term rentals available, and those rentals have disappeared from the short-term market by 2024. What happened to them? Well, in the case of this particular host, they made them longer-term rentals. They moved them, changed the minimum nights available for the rental to be more than 32 nights at a go, so that they were no longer being regulated under the short-term rental regulations. And that's a thing that can happen when you are focused on regulating one segment of the market, is sometimes people try to avoid those regulations by moving into another market segment. So I wanted to think about how often is that happening in Chicago. So I looked at the change in category for each of these listings. About 1,921 listings that were active in 2020 were still active in 2024. And indeed, many more of them went from being short-term listings to long-term listings than the other way around. But in the course of figuring that out, I also found this. Almost 4,500 people left Airbnb. Almost 4,500 listings left Airbnb in this time period. And that is a much larger number than the number of listings that moved between the short-term and longer-term categories. So that tells me there's something going on here maybe that has more to do with some other factor than it has to do with regulations and the avoidance of regulations. I will note that this number may be, this almost 4,500 listings leaving Airbnb may be overreported slightly, and that is because I was not able to determine if a particular listing had been sold by one host to another host. If I had an apartment in 2020 that was listed, and then I sold it to someone else who then listed it under, their own profile in Airbnb, the ID number would change in the data. So it would be treated like a whole new listing. I did try to track these by looking at the coordinates. They did give me a latitude and longitude for each listing. But something has happened with Airbnb between 2020 and 2024 so that it looks like they are maybe calculating those or determining those coordinates a little bit differently, because even my 1921 listings that were still there live under the same listing ID numbers in both data sets, many of them had different coordinates, and I think the house or the apartment probably didn't move. So I'm thinking they're using some different methodology to determine where exactly a location is between these two data sets. So that's a limitation. I was not able to solve that problem, unfortunately. So that 4476 may be overreported slightly because it can't account for any of those kinds of changes. But it's still a pretty big percentage of total listings from 2020. And, 2020 was not that long ago. We probably all remember that it was not a great year for travel. And so it occurs to me, well, okay, maybe so many people are leaving Airbnb because of the pandemic, because, no one is renting, no one is traveling, no one is renting short-term rentals in 2020. So I tried to do a little bit of digging to find out. And for the purpose of this next slide, I am focused really specifically on one segment of the short-term rental market, and I'll tell you why. For this slide, I am only looking at short-term rentals that are renting a whole house or an apartment, and that are available to be rented for at least half the year. Now that's because I wanted to do some looking at performance, and I didn't think it was fair to treat the kind of Airbnb where it's somebody renting out their spare room, or the kind of Airbnb where it's somebody renting out maybe their house for 2 weeks while they're on vacation somewhere else and it's not available to be rented the rest of the year. I only wanted to look at listings where I thought, oh, okay, this listing is there to be rented as an income producing unit. The owner is probably not living there because it's available more than half the year. And it's the kind of space that really maybe could be rented out for someone to live there in a more traditional way, rather than being rented as a short-term rental to tourists. So that's the segment of the market I'm looking at here, and that's why. And so I wanted to first look in this top graph at performance in terms of bookings. And what I found was in 2020, most of the listings in this category, more than 500 of the listings in this category, got less than one booking per month. And you can kind of see how that distribution of bookings changes. We do have some listings that are being booked maybe 8 or 9 times a month, some that are being booked more often, but most commonly, they're being booked not at all or less than one time a month. And so I was able to take that information and kind of estimate maybe how much money someone is making on each of these units. And that's what this bottom graph is. This is a calculation that estimates maybe how much money someone is making on a unit by looking at the number of bookings per month, by looking at the asking price per night, and the minimum night stay. And then I've kind of normalized that calculation to take into account that, some of these bookings really are available only 180 days of the year or only 270 days of the year, and some of them are available all year round. And so I wanted to try to even out the calculation, normalize the data across all of those different levels of availability. What I found here, and this is an estimate, this performance data is not something that came to me in my data set. I had to calculate it. But what I find based on my estimation is that, boy, in 2020, a lot of people who are renting out Airbnbs, short-term rentals, probably as a vehicle to make money, are not making as much money as the median rent. In 2020, the median rent for an apartment in Chicago, $16,896 a year. And most of my listings, they're not making that. Now, of course, some people are, and some people are making many, many times that median rent. Got a couple of listings way out here that are making $130,000 a year, maybe, or $145,000 a year. But most folks, maybe they could have done better in 2020 by just leasing out their property as a standard rental. So, but again, that's 2020. There was a pandemic. Not a lot of traveling going on during most of the year. So maybe that's unusual. Maybe this data is not representative of how things normally go. So I wanted to take my 2024 data set and do the same kind of calculations. Well, 2024, folks are definitely doing better in the market, but there's still a substantial portion that aren't receiving very many bookings at all during a month. There's still a substantial proportion that aren't making, probably, based on my estimation, maybe aren't making as much as they could make just renting the place out in a more traditional way to someone who's going to live there. The median rent has gone up. We definitely see more listings in 2024 that are outperforming that median rent, but we're still seeing that most of them aren't. And to me, that says, maybe the market in Chicago for short-term rentals is oversaturated. Maybe we've got a lot of people coming in here thinking they're going to make a lot of money, finding that maybe they're not making the return on income that they're hoping to get. And that's the kind of thing that I think would drive people leaving the market at the kind of rate that I saw between 2020 and 2024. So my takeaway from all of this investigation is this. If Chicago's goals in their regulation include limiting professional hosts, that part's not working. The majority of properties available on Airbnb as short-term rentals are owned by hosts with multiple listings, and the share of hosts with multiple listings is going up. It increased significantly from 2020 to 2024. But if Chicago's only really concerned about limiting short-term rentals overall, just making sure that every rentable apartment in the city doesn't become an Airbnb, they're doing okay at that. The total short-term rentals did decline over the period from 2020 to 2024, and I think that as much as regulations may have to do with that, market forces are probably also a significant factor. That gap in between expectation and what your actual return on investment might be could be driving that limitation. I did also note, although I didn't get into it in this presentation, that longer-term rentals of furnished apartments are on the increase in Chicago, and some hosts in that category are also accumulating large numbers of properties. That's sort of outside the scope of my research here today, but I think that may be an area of concern in the future for Chicago. And so that's something I'm interested in looking into as further research. In addition, I'm interested in learning how Chicago's short-term rental market compares to other U.S. cities with different kinds of regulations. I acknowledge a limitation in this research is that my data is from 2020 and 2024, but Chicago's regulations were introduced in 2016, so I'm really interested to know maybe how did the market change when those regulations were introduced? What was it like before 2016? And I'm interested in knowing how do these month-to-month furnished apartment rentals affect the housing market in Chicago and in other cities? They're not short-term rentals, they're not aimed at tourists, but are they really a housing solution? Maybe, maybe not. I'm interested in finding out. So those are some questions I'm interested in looking into in the future. But for today, thank you for listening, and I hope that you enjoyed it.